Good morning, live community, crime community. I'm here to read about Lord Byron by James G. McGann. Byron was born in London the year before the French Revolution broke out in Paris in 1789. He died in Greece in 1824. Since that time, students of history and literature have often dated the Romantic period, 1789 to 1824, partly because the character of this period was so determined by the special epochal events in France, and partly because the career of Byron seemed at once its summary and its climax. No other literary figure, not even Goethe, was so widely and actively engaged with the important people and events of this time. Unlike Wordsworth, who stands with Byron as preeminent among the great English poets of the period, Byron was an European writer, and if the pun be permitted, man of affairs. Everything he wrote established explicit flirtations with the world in which he moved, and his work sought, in addition, to see and represent the historical patterns and continuities which connected the present to the recent and distant past. Byron's work is, in very sense, a poetry of experience. From his earliest to his latest work, however, the experiences which underpin both the deeds and the ideas of Byron's literary work assume a peculiar and characteristic form. Byron writes himself into all of his poetry, of course, and the self thus represents is always viewed in the detailed context of impinging social and historical relations. More, Byron insists increasingly so as his career unfolds that the context which envelops his life is the world historical dimensions. The quality of his work is reflected in all its material aspects, in the sweeping range of its topics, subjects, and models, classical and European alike, ancient and modern, English and continental, in its deliberate embrace of the most traditional and most experimental poetic forms, and finally in the range of the styles which he not only used but also took seriously, from the most ephemeral types of street songs, ballads, and vers de solité, to the heroic manners of the tales, the high rhetoric of the satires, and the noble number of poems like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. In the end, this is to say, in Don Juan, he reinvented for the changing Western culture a new high style in poetry that answered to the variegated and dynamic, not to say chaotic and unstable, social circumstances in which we now call the modern world. Like Heine, Pushkin, and Baudelaire, after him, all poets, quite conscious of the tradition they had chosen, Byron's masterpiece spoke in a new vulgaris equivalentia. Byron was deep interested in the poetic traditions and the place he occupied within them. We see this very clearly throughout Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and it's explicit to the dedication and the former and the opening stanzas of Canto 4 of the latter. But more in his place in the temple of poetic frame, Byron was interested in his place in world history, and more particularly and more immediately in the mission for which he believed he was fated to accomplish. Not every reader responds sympathetically to this grand, even theatrical way in which Byron conceives and represents himself. Though few resist or even try to resist the Don Juan manner of his theatricality. Nevertheless, it is crucial to understand that all of Byron's poetry, even the work which might appear trivial, is self-conceived in a vast and finally in a heroic frame of reference. All of his heroes, we know, are surrogates of himself, more or less displaced. They are, as well as figures moving under the domination of even obscure purpose and destiny. Manfred's life is ruled by his star, and it is thus that Byron understands and represents himself in his work. This quality has been aptly called Byron's need of fatality. It lies in the heart of his entire life's work, and it achieves his greatest expression in his greatest poem, Don Juan. To understand the fate which Byron needs and which he then told generated to answer that need, we have to see the human world in which he imagined himself to exist, for it is this world which his poetry half perceives and half creates. When Wordsworth recalls in the prelude the period in which his youthful imagination was nurtured, he narrates a series of benevolence and wonders. These culminate in the experiences of the early years of the French Revolution, when Wordsworth says Europe is to say, the new Europe, whose promise seems to have been dawning was thrilled with joy, France standing on the top of golden hours, and human nature seeming born again. Subsequent events would overbear Wordsworth's correspondent sense of joy and force him to internalize the human promise of his early socialized imagination of the new dawn. Wordsworth, carried as a poet, is thus founded in a new set of golden hours, not just the early years of the French Revolution, but immediately previously, years when, according to the myth of his life, when he formulated for himself, Wordsworth grew up in the benevolent embrace of nature. For Byron, however, the time when his imagination's eye began to see the world, the first decade of the 19th century, was a dark time. All of Europe was embroiled in the struggle with France, whose revolution had fallen into the hands of a brilliant and ambitious Napoleon. At first council and then as emperor, Napoleon reconstituted the social structure of France and aimed at the transformation of political structure of all of Europe. His chief adversary in this struggle was England. Through all of European powers were involved in various ways and degrees. Between 1801 and 1809, the situation was peculiarly ambiguous and volatile, while complex alliances and coalitions being formed between the different European states, only to be dismantled and replaced by other arrangements. These are the years of which Napoleon's career reached its zenith, years marked by many of his outstanding military exploits on one hand, by a series of remarkable diplomatic and political maneuvers on the other. Byron's first book, a privately printed volume called Fugitive Pieces, was produced late in 1806 for private circulation. The book cultivates precocity and inconsequence, a loose collection of largely wretched verse, school exercises, mostly of sentimental poems celebrating Byron's female amours and male friends. One distant quality of the book is its extreme and its affected self-consciousness, yet the one subject about which Byron is not self-conscious is the current state of European affairs and England's part in these momentous events. It is as if Fugitive Pieces has been produced as a resort from the larger English and European scene. The book's audience, like its topics and human subject, is located either in Cambridge or the tight Midland Society of Southwell. The next year and a half, that is between late 1806 and March 1808, Byron revised and expanded his first book 3 times, first as another privately printed volume called Poems on Various Occasions, January 1807, and then in his first 2 published works, Hours of Idleness, June 1807, and Poems Original and Translated, March 1808. These books extended his autobiographical structure of fugitive pieces, both internally and externally, and added poems either fill out Byron's self-portrait in the context of his life. A number of the poems are explicit comments on earlier poems, as well as on the reactions which those poems had caused among friends and enemies, and then the book as a whole reaches out for a wider audience, in particular reaches out to London and the centers of English culture. The results of Byron's effort to make contact with the larger public was something more than he had expected. Hours of Idleness were reviewed to the influential Edinburgh Review in a scathing ad hominem fashion. Though Byron at the time believed the review had been written by the chief editor, Francis Jeffrey, it was actually the work of Henry Botham, the reformist lawyer and politician who would later incur Byron's implacable hatred of other reasons entirely. This famous review is important in the history of Byron's work and career for a number of reasons. In the first place, it was the impetus behind the publication of Byron's first major poem, English Bards and Scott Reviewers. Secondly, it exposed a number of the contradictions which Byron had experienced and registered in himself and in his society alike. The production of the work like English Bards and Scotch Reviewers was an act of enormous pretension for a person who had barely reached his majority. Nevertheless, we now must see it as all but inevitable conclusion to the process which Byron had set in motion when he first issued Fugitive Pieces. For the later's coy self-consciousness led to the even more personal and self-conscious Hours of Idleness, which in turn produced the Edinburgh Review's ridiculing notice, the impetus behind Byron's broad-ranging critique of English letters and culture in 1808. Byron woke up to find himself world famous in 1812 when Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a romaunt, was published, and this later event had been aptly prepared by the publication of his satire, 3 years earlier by the immediate aftermath of that publication. 3 more authorized editions of English Bards was produced between 1809 and 1811. Byron's satire was served to extend even further in social context in which he insisted upon asserting and defining himself. In so doing, however, Byron was forced to confront English society in a much larger frame of reference and to deal with a number of contradictions in which he had scarcely been aware. When he wrote his early poetry, Byron's closest circles and sympathies were reformist and Whig. Thus, it was a particular shock to find himself made an object of ridicule in the Edinburgh Review. When he struck back, he found his readiness weapons when he supplied by the reactionary, anti-Jacobin, and by conservative literary voices like William Gifford. It is a consequence, most notable quality of English bards and Scottish reviewers, of the particular and idiosyncratic nature of its social critique. Byron singles out a few individuals for praise and honor, but his attack is launched at the culture as a whole and is able to see no party, no class, no institution for which to identify. English culture is represented in a state of crisis, and Byron is but a voice in its wilderness. With its publication of his satire, Byron completed his plans for leaving England. The famous trip to the peninsula and finally to the Turkish dominions of the Levant produced his equally famous account of that trip and the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold, which he published after he returned in July 1811. Here, for the first time, Byron projected his sense of social and cultural crisis to interlude the whole of Europe. The focus of his analysis is, of course, an English one, but his is an English review that has transcended the chauvinistic, patriotic interpretations of English affairs, which were current and common in England at the time. With this book, in fact, almost all the basic lines of Byron's thinking, if not the conclusions of that thinking, we are set in place. It is important, therefore, that we very clearly, in context which stands behind the received expressions in his famous publication. As an Englishman sympathizing with the Republican and reformist movement set in motion by the French Revolution, Byron was deeply ambivalent about his country's antagonistic relationship to France. Unlike Wordsworth or Coleridge, for example, Byron responded to the European situation from a point of departure nearer the turn of the century when the outbreak of the Revolution a decade earlier. Because of this, Byron did not find it natural to locate the source of his period's evils and dislocations of the Reign of Terror, and hence in France's betrayal of her own cause. People like Wordsworth and Coleridge saw England as the last reliable defense against French imperialism and the total destruction of the social fabric of Europe. But from Byron's later vantage, the situation appeared very different. What Byron saw was a history of growing reaction against the goals of the revolution. Increasingly, Britain found herself compelled to lead the defense of ancient and entrenched European privilege, to form alliances abroad, the appearance to dishonor her traditional ideals of freedom and liberty, and to repress at home in England and Ireland various actual struggles to express or implement those ideals. And in the pursuit of these ends, the spokesman of English policies resorted to what Byron saw was a canting and hypocritical denunciation of France and justification of English moves. Byron's ambivalence was further complicated by the charismatic presence of Napoleon, both in his vision of a republican transformation of Europe and his actual display of tactical and strategic genius in political and military affairs alike. This disturbed and disturbing view of his own country's ideals and policies first came into unmistakable focus for Byron in the summer of 1807, when England seized the Danish fleet and bombarded Copenhagen. A truce was arranged, but in 1808, England was again betrayed Denmark by supporting a Swedish invasion with an expeditionary force of 12,000 troops under Sir John Moore. The Whig opposition raised an outcry, and the whole set of events involved a serious moral setback for English policies, both at home and abroad. Byron himself first explicitly denounced these events in his poetry in 1811, in the mordant, sarcastic attack privately printed in 1812 as The Curse of Minerva. The unsensible subject of this poem is Lord Elgin's efforts to save or maraud the Pantheon sculptures. In fact, the satire culminates in a wholesale denunciation of British policy in Europe, including the Peninsula and Denmark, in Ireland, in the Levant, and even in India. It was the first two cantos of Childe Harold, in which articulated Byron's most compelling and most comprehensive analysis of this social and political situation. The two principal loci of Byron's travels poems are the Peninsula, which are the latest phase of the struggles between France and the Allied forces led by England, had interrupted, and by Levant, Greece in particular, where Byron went to escape the depressing theater of European affairs and perhaps to rediscover for the present and for himself the source and basis of Europe's most cherished social and cultural ideas, when he found instead was in the Peninsular War a mere nest of vipers, and in the East a debasement of European culture. The debasement appeared most graphically in the hallowed places of ancient Greece, which Byron saw as having been inherited and inhabited by unworthy people. This included the supine Greeks themselves and their Turkish overlords, as well as the opportunist and self-serving Europeans who made their interest in the area, that is, the English, the French, and the Russians. Thus, the current state of Greece became for Byron the very symbol of the current state of European culture at large. When Byron embodied and published this negative and critical assessment in 1812, he achieved all but instant celebrity throughout Europe and in England. Later readers have occasionally condensed to fame Byron reaped with Childe Harold's pilgrimage, the Romantant, but the book is a signal and important, even both in social and in literary history. In one stroke, Byron defined and reflected back to the people of England and all Europe a crucial insight into the meaning of age, into the human significance of the momentous event, which, when even then taking place, the book had found a means to focus and isolate in a tangible way the complex and obscure patterns of events which were affecting so many individual lives and social structures at the time. More of this, the book argued, that was what's most deplorable about living at such a time was to be measured in terms of the individual's life. Europe was tearing itself apart from England to the Caucasus, and the spectacle of political ruin that was no more than an expression of what was truly to be lamented, the suffering which it brought to the lives of the individual persons, the bleeding heart which Byron trailed across Europe because of the expression of an epochal experience, only because it was first and fundamentally the expression of a single identifiable person. The first two cantos of Childe Harold are also important because of the character of the person who delivers its message. The child, Byron's surrogate, is like his creator, Byron, not merely culturally and socially disaffected. He is young, privileged, and disaffected. This is an important aspect of the book, since it deepens the poem's message of despair, that the hero is experiencing sorrow in his youth, projects an image of desperate future, while the privilege of the circumstances, in every sense, tells us that the social body has been wounded, even most protected areas. Furthermore, Byron's decision to use symbolic forms, including fictive characters as slightly displaced figures of himself in propria persona, was to have profound significance in the entire future course of Western literary work. In more immediate terms, the romantic emphasis on the personality of the poet was to become one of the hallmarks of all of Byron's poetry. I'd like to read one more thing about this guy, Jerome G. McGann, if I can find it. Well, George Gordon, that's Lord Byron, was born in London in January 22nd, 1788. On his mother's side, he was Scottish of French extraction. His father's family was ancient and noble and came to England with William the Conqueror. He was born with a deformed right foot. With the death of the fifth Baron Byron of Rochdale early in 1798, and the default of nearer heirs, he succeeded to the title. As Lord Byron, he was soon to become the most famous poet of his age, as well as one of the most celebrated and most notorious characters. His career spans a momentous period of European history in which Byron himself was deeply involved. The crucial dates of his career are 1812, when he rocketed to fame with his publication of Childe Harold, in 1816, when his marriage failed, and he left England in 1824, when he died in Missolonghi, Greece, and where he had gone to join his forces struggling for Greek independence. Jerome J. McGann is a John Stuart Byron University professor, University of Virginia, and the Thomas Holloway Professor of Victorian Studies, Royal Holloway College, University of London. He has published widely in 19th and 20th century literature and the editor of Byron's Complete Poetical Works in 7 volumes. That's a lesson today for Mr. McGann. We will have another lesson tomorrow if I'm still around. God bless and have a good day.